Good afternoon, everyone. This is Helen Folks, and I will be presenting transitional standards for milk, sodium, and whole grain today. Please go ahead and use your chat box as I go through the presentation to input any questions you may have. The state agency team is on standby to answer those questions by the end of our session today. I would like to open coverage of this topic by explaining that USDA is working to implement updates for the coming academic years as part of ongoing efforts to enhance healthy, nutritious school meals, while agencies and CMP operators are working to recover from issues relating to the COVID-19 pandemic. These transitional meal standards planned for implementation over the next 2 school years are intended to give schools time to transition from current operations to more typical operations and meal patterns. These standards include updates to milk, whole grain, and sodium requirements for school meals. USDA has emphasized a gradual transition from the extraordinary circumstances caused by the pandemic to normal program operations and meal standards that are consistent with the dietary guidelines for Americans. The transitional standards include that schools may offer low-fat flavored milk in addition to other non-fat and low-fat milk options. At least 80% of grains in school breakfasts and lunches per week must be whole grain rich. And starting in the 23-24 school year, there will be a 10% decrease in the weekly sodium limit for school lunches only. The weekly sodium limit for the 2022-2023 school year will remain at current levels. To emphasize the benefits of school meal participation by students, I will reference some groundbreaking research and studies leading to a USDA fact sheet that celebrates the health impact of school meals on our nation's children. So this takes us to this slide that shows that school lunches are the most nutritious. Now, Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack emphasized to the media that the transitional standards will help schools transition to a future that builds upon the tremendous strides child nutrition program operators have already made in improving school meal nutrition over the past decade. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention published the benefits of school meals, including improved classroom behavior, success in academics, and benefits to overall student health beyond the school day. Research shows that students who participate in the school meal programs consume more whole grains, milk, fruits, and vegetables during meal times and have better overall diet quality than non-participants. Eating breakfast at school is associated with better attendance rates, fewer missed school days, and ultimately better test scores. Meal pattern requirements were revised in 2012 to include more fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and to decrease the amount of sodium and trans fat. Research shows that these changes have helped make school meals more nutritious. Findings from the School Nutrition and Meal Cost Study, published in a fact sheet in June of 2021, shows that children who eat school lunches score higher on the Healthy Eating Index, or HEI, which is based on criteria consistent with the dietary guidelines for Americans. This fact sheet is linked to the title on this slide. This pictorial shows lunches from home, represented by a blue lunchbox, and lunch at school represented by a green lunch tray. Students eating school lunch have HEI scores of 80 compared to those who don't participate in school meals, having a much lower healthy eating index of 65. Also, students who eat school lunches are more likely to consume milk, fruits, and vegetables while consuming fewer desserts, snacks, and non-milk beverages like sodas than students who brought lunch from home. Despite the challenges of the pandemic, the steadfast work and commitment of child nutrition operators continues to show meaningful changes that improve the diets and overall health of children. As a timeline of events that brought us to the transitional meal standards, I would like to start with the event of April 13th, 2020, when the U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland found a procedural error with the promulgation of the 2018 final rule for child nutrition programs. These allowed meal pattern flexibilities for milk, whole grains, and sodium requirements. This turned back the clock to the 2012 meal pattern, canceling the meal pattern flexibilities that were in place starting in 2018. Shortly thereafter, in March of 2020, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic, and on March 22nd, 2020, Governor Edwards issued a stay-at-home order to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. Understandably, the pandemic and related challenges dominated everyone's time and attention, specifically amongst CMP operators responding and redesigning program operations to feed Louisiana's children in this emergency situation. Now, this has been unlike any other emergency I have experienced in my lifetime, and it's probably like that for most of you. For that reason, messages and media attention for the vacated final rule for the meal pattern lost the spotlight. As we all know, focus on waivers and flexibilities became paramount in the world of child nutrition in order to provide meals in a new service environment. USDA waivers provided for flexibilities for milk, whole grains, and the sodium requirement. And these waivers were widely elected by SFAs for school year 21-22. However, many of these waivers have expired, which brings us to school year 22-23. So bringing us back to our current times, there have been unforeseen consequences of the pandemic, including continued staff shortages, supply chain issues affecting foods and supplies available for purchase, as well as delivery shortages and substitutions for typical C&P bid items. The challenge now is trying to figure out if or when business as usual will actually return and what that will actually look like in the coming school years. The transitional standards for the meal pattern that I'm presenting today is largely in response to the need for an adjustment period prior to taking the meal pattern standards back to the much stricter guidelines outlined for milk, whole grains, and sodium in the 2012 meal pattern. While everyone should make efforts to transition over the next 2 school years, the state agency does understand that this is not going to be a hit or miss scenario. USDA acknowledges that the intent for the transitional meal standards is to provide a period of adjustment. And remember, as we go through the training, that C&P operators are not expected to hit the bullseye on transitional standards on the first day, but should begin working on bid specifications and communications to work toward meeting requirements. Pandemic issues do remain, and the state agency will work with you throughout this process. The intention of the transitional period is to work toward meeting these standards, to encourage operators to work with vendors, collaborate with other child nutrition program operators, and also with the state agency to overcome any barriers you're having to meeting these standards. As a reminder, without the transitional meal standards, the 2012 meal pattern requirements would have applied for this school year. These requirements included that flavored milk be only non-fat, 100% of grains served would have been required to be whole grain rich, and the much stricter target 3 sodium levels were to be in effect for both breakfast and lunch for school year 22-23 based on the 2012 rule. Next up is a snapshot of the transitional meal standards. The good news regarding the transitional meal standards is that schools may offer flavored low-fat milk or 1% milk, in addition to unflavored low-fat milk and flavored or unflavored non-fat milk. This option will remain in place over the next 2 school years, being school year 22-23 and extending through school year 23-24. In terms of sodium, the limit for school lunch and breakfast will remain at the target 1 level for the entirety of next school year, being of this school year being 22-23. And in planning for 23-24, school lunch meals are the focus, and a 10% reduction in sodium will be required. Instead of going to the stricter target 2 or target 3 sodium limits previously planned, USDA has determined that a target 1A sodium limit will apply to lunch, and this will apply to lunch only. Breakfast patterns will stay the same at target 1 through the next 2 school years, all the way through the end of school year 23-24. For whole grains, at least 80% of the grains served over the course of a week must be whole grain rich. It is important to note that the definition of whole grain rich continues to mean that at least half or 50% of grain ingredients in a recipe or product formulation statement must be whole grain rich. There will be no need to change recipes that already qualify as whole grain rich to meet these requirements. The change in requirements is reflective of a shift from half of the grain offerings over the course of the week being whole grain rich to now an increase to 80% of the grain offerings over the course of the week being whole grain rich. I plan to go into more detail on the standards as we progress through this training. If you're wondering, this is a really good snapshot. If you're wondering how to communicate the transitional meal standards that are in place, this is a good snapshot of everything that's going to change and has changed. While the transitional rule impacts the types of milk allowed, sodium levels, and whole grain rich items required, the following areas are not impacted in the rule. First, the amount of food required in any component. Second, fruits, vegetables, meat alternate components. And third, calorie ranges, saturated fat limits, and age or grade groups. Schools and industry shared that it was not realistic to go back to the 2012 standards due to the challenges presented during and then after the pandemic. So in response, a two-step approach was developed by USDA to allow time for collaborative work with the goal of a new rule for permanent long-term standards for school meal patterns. The long-term plan will be built on the progress already made by child nutrition program operators in implementing healthier meals for students over the last decade. The next step in the development of permanent standards will encompass nutrition science reflected in the dietary guidelines for Americans, engagement of stakeholders, and public input on proposed changes that will be collected and evaluated. Finalization of permanent standards and implementation is expected to take place for school year 2024-2025. Goals for the standards include that they will be practical, achievable, nutrition science-based, and developed to put children's health as the top priority. Effective July 1st, 2022, transitional meal standards for milk will extend into school year 2023 and school year 2024. The transition allows the option to serve flavored, low-fat milk in NSLP and SBP, and remember that flavored, non-fat skim milk is still an option. Unflavored milk must be offered at each NSLP SBP meal service, being either 1% or non-fat. This option for flavored low-fat milk extends to smart snacks in schools. CNP operators still have the option to not offer flavored milk and simply offer 1% and fat-free unflavored milk. Offering a variety of milk options is still a requirement in both the National School Lunch Program and School Breakfast Program. Lactose-free and reduced lactose milk meet the requirements for fluid milk, and no written or medical statement is required. Hopefully, the flexibility to offer 1% flavored milk as part of the milk variety will simplify procurement of milk and allow the time needed over the next 2 years for supply chain recovery. Comments from the survey also emphasize that allowing more options for milk, including the 1% flavored milk, help to increase consumption of milk by children. At a minimum, at least 80% of the grains offered over the course of the week must be whole grain rich. The remaining 20% of grains must be enriched. This allows flexibilities in terms of substitution for a grain item when certain items are not available. This also allows for an enriched grain to be served when the whole grain rich item is not acceptable to students. Whole grain rich means that a product or recipe must contain at least 50% whole grain. The remaining grains in the recipe or product must be enriched. This is not a change, so the whole grain rich recipes and products approved for use in the child nutrition programs prior to the transitional meal standards are still considered as part of the 80% required whole grain rich offerings for the week. When thinking about the 80% whole grain rich requirement, this will typically mean that 1 2-ounce portion of bread or grain per week may be enriched. The remaining grains offered over the course of the week by meal type must be whole grain rich. Now, for resources on whole grain rich items, you can refer to the links highlighted in teal on this slide, including the USDA Food Buying Guide. But I please want you to make a note here that there is an updated whole grain resource available on the website for USDA F&S. There is also the Exhibit A grains tool that is very helpful in determining ounce equivalents. For menu planning to meet the 80% whole grain rich requirement over the course of the week, this table shows an enriched 2-ounce grain offered on Friday. The remaining days of the week, Monday through Thursday, show 2 ounces of whole grain rich items offered. Although there are other portion options for meeting the 80% whole grain rich goal, a once-a-week substitution or planned enriched grain is likely the most straightforward and easy to understand method for menu planning and instruction for C&P managers and staff. The state agency does understand that while bid specifications and ordering can be implemented to meet this goal, supply chain disruptions and/or delivery substitutions may disrupt the best made plans. With this in mind, the state agency plans to work with SFAs as the transitional meal standards goals are in process toward achievement. In discussion of sodium targets for the transitional rule, the same Target 1 sodium limits that have been in place for several years will continue throughout school year 22-23. The school year of 22-23 is intended to allow time for product reformulation by manufacturers, school menu adjustments, recipe development, and training of child nutrition program managers and staff to decrease sodium in meals. While the SBP meals will remain the Target 1 sodium limits for school year 23-24, the interim Target 1A will go into effect for school lunch only on July 1, 2023 for school year 23-24. The reason the target is changing for school lunch is because there is a greater need to decrease sodium in school lunch than there is for school breakfast. This Target 1A is less restrictive than the Target 2 and Target 3 guidelines initially planned for implementation, but still put school meal programs on a path toward sodium reduction. Let's take a look at what the sodium target levels will look like over the next 2 years at lunch. In year 1, the Target 1 levels will remain the same, while in year 2, there is a 10% decrease in the maximum sodium levels for school lunch. Sodium levels are set by age grade group. As an example, the Target 1 sodium levels for K through 5 are limited to 1,230 milligrams at lunch during the 22-23 school year, and decrease to 1,110 milligrams at lunch for the 23-24 school year. Sodium levels apply as an average over the school week and are not set as daily limits. This allows for some flexibility over the course of 5 days, with some menus being higher in sodium and others being lower. The sodium chart for the school breakfast program remains as it has been at the Target 1 level for the next 2 school years, being 22-23 and 23-24. As with the National School Lunch Program, sodium limits apply on average over the course of the week and do not apply on a per-day basis. This allows for higher and lower sodium breakfast menus to balance out over the school week. In order to provide creative ways to boost flavor with less sodium, What's Shaking for School Nutrition Professionals, linked in the title above, provides education about the importance of decreasing sodium in children's diets and how schools can make a difference. This guide provides guidance on using herbs and spices, including flavor stations where students can add seasonings without added sodium to appeal to their tastes. Can also provide access to explore new lower sodium recipes and encourage ways to maximize the use of USDA foods that have no added salt or they're lower in sodium. There's also information on how to write bid specifications for appealing lower sodium options. Now that we have covered the transitional standards for the next 2 school years, let's go over a summary of the new rule. Starting July 1st, 2022, school food service had the option to serve flavored low-fat milk in the National School Lunch and School Breakfast program. This option is also extended to smart snacks. Whole grain rich foods will constitute 80% of the offerings over the course of a week's menu for both breakfast and lunch, and the remaining 20% of grains must be enriched. Sodium targets will remain at target 1 for all of school year 22-23. For lunch only, a target 1A will require a 10% reduction in sodium. For the school breakfast program, the sodium target will remain at target 1 for this school year and the following school year, being school year 22-23 and school year 23-24. As a resource to implementing the transitional standards, access the Child Nutrition Recipe Box by going to the Institute of Child Nutrition's USDA Standardized Recipes page and explore the expanding recipe selections that meet the requirements outlined in the transitional standards. Child Nutrition Recipe Box at the upper right-hand corner of this page is hyperlinked directly to the Institute of Child Nutrition's site. The state agency and USDA encourages comments on the transitional standards final rule. USDA invites comments on transitional meal standards for milk, whole grain rich items, sodium, suggestions related to implementation of nutrition goals described in the dietary guidelines for Americans, and other meal pattern changes that may be needed. So this comment period did end on March 24th, 2022. There is a link to the regulations.gov site for commenting on these and other things that are now currently open. And you can access that by the QR code on this page. Now, we're hoping that we will hear some things about what will be upcoming about more permanent standards based on the comments provided by people like you and other people that were in the community that are interested in seeing how these transitional meal pattern standards and a final rule should take place. Over the course of many years and highlighted responses from the Transitional Meal Standards Survey, C&P directors, staff, and stakeholders have worked diligently toward providing healthier school meals to prioritize the health and well-being of children. In closing, the transitional meal pattern training portion, I would like to celebrate with you the successes shared by C&P directors across Louisiana in meeting meal pattern goals progressively over the years. Students are picking up a fruit or vegetable with each meal. Whole grain rich blended products that included 50% whole grain rich ingredients at a minimum are now widely accepted by students. A variety of whole grain rich foods that were once foreign to the students in Louisiana are now welcome and consumed by students. Milk consumption by students has increased as part of school meal participation, and grab and go services have expanded, are now widely accepted by school staff, and have resulted in improved participation. Before we conclude the webinar today, please give me a moment to review any chat box questions. And I'll take a look, and if you have any additional questions, please go ahead and type them in now. So it looks like we don't have any questions at this time, and I really want to thank you for your participation today in the Transitional Meal Patterns Meal Standards training. If you do find that after this training is over that you have questions about today's topic, please contact the Louisiana Department of Education Division of Nutrition Support by emailing childnutritionprograms@la.gov or contact us by phone at 225-342-9661.